I just want to welcome everybody this morning. We are in for a treat today, and it's my privilege to introduce to you somebody that needs no introduction, probably, and that is our own archivist here at St. John's, Cathy O'Donnell, and she is going to give us some wonderful highlights about the history of St. John's. So please welcome Cathy. Now, let me just tell you a little, some ground rules, and that is she's going to make her presentation, and afterward, you're free to ask questions, which she will answer, but come up here, and we'll turn this around, and come up and ask your questions into this microphone so that it benefits the people who are viewing it from online. All right? And without further ado, Cathy, it's all yours.
Thank you, everyone. Before I get started, I hope you all had a chance to see the insert in the bulletin. It's on both sides this month, covering 2 different decades of our history and the history around the world. But it's great to have this opportunity to speak again about one of my favorite subjects, St. John's. As many of you know, I've been a volunteer archivist here since 2011. I have gathered information from William Offutt's book, who, by the way, is the grandson of one of our founders. He wrote the book Bethesda, A Social History, and he's known in historical groups as Mr. Bethesda or Mr. History, depending on who you talk to. Unfortunately, he died earlier this year, or I would have invited him here today. But his book is called Bethesda, A Social History. Other books are Old Bethesda by Dory Germain Holman and Bethesda Not So Old by Gertrude D. Bradley. R. Hanson Whiteman's book, St. John's, 1874 to 1965, and newspaper articles that were given to me by Phil Graham, a fellow parishioner. And last but not least, the archives at St. John's, which go back to 1873, and there's some information before that. And I also refer to the diocese archives in Maryland and in Washington, D.C. For those of you who have heard me speak in the past, a lot of this is going to be what you've heard before, because history doesn't change. But I hope you'll find interesting some of the new tidbits I picked up. To start at the very beginning, St. John's is on Piscataway and Natchitoches land. Under colonial pressure, the Natchitoches eventually merged into the Piscataway. It is appropriate that we gratefully acknowledge Native peoples on whose ancestral homelands we gather, as well as the diverse and vibrant Native communities who make their home here today. That land acknowledgement was from the National Museum of the American Indian. So let's get started. In 1873, Ulysses S. Grant was president, and Queen Victoria ruled over all of Great Britain, which at that time was huge. People rode their horse and buggies to church on Sunday mornings. Having been named a town in 1871, just 2 years prior to us, Bethesda was just a dot on the map. As there were no Episcopal churches in the area, people living in Bethesda had to ride a considerable distance on horseback or horse and buggy to go to church. They traveled to down the Washington and Rockville Turnpike, which is now Wisconsin Avenue, to St. John's, Georgetown, or over to Lambeth Parish, which is now Grace Church in Silver Spring. You can only imagine the complaining they did by the time they got there. It's a tiring ride, I would think, on horseback, taking more than an hour to get there. So in 1873, with the approval of the Diocese of Maryland, the Lambeth Parish decided to start a mission church, and that's us. I'd like to tell you a little bit about the rector at Grace Church, who became our first rector. It tells something about the community that we settled in. He was born, his name was James Battle Everett, and he was born on a slave-owning plantation in North Carolina. He was ordained in the Episcopal Church in 1861 and almost immediately was commissioned a chaplain in the Confederate Army, where he served in the cavalry. The sad truth is he was very proud of his service for the Confederacy in the war and of slavery. He gave several speeches about his feelings on those two intertwined subjects. In fact, in 1901, he wrote a book, The Old Plantation, How We Lived in the Great House and Cabin Before the War, which according to Wikipedia was his response to Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was, as you all know, very popular at that time. In his book, Reverend Everett states, and this is very hard for me to say, we older Southern people are proud of and thankful for the blessed days of the Old South. Full well we know that no portion of human history has been so ignorantly misunderstood or painfully misjudged than the slaveholding era of the South. Lisa, could we have the next slide? The one after that. So it's a sad statement by an unapologetic adherent of the old ways of the South, particularly slavery. He looks a little scary to me, like it's something out of a Dickens novel, or I'm not sure I'd be smiled when I saw him. But he was an unapologetic adherent of the Old South, particularly slavery. Yet he was our rector and rector of the other churches in Lambeth Parish. After the Civil War ended, he came to Grace Church as their rector and was there when the decision was made to start a mission church in Bethesda. He served as a rector here from 1873 to 1886. Maryland was a slave state before and during most of the Civil War. This doesn't necessarily mean everyone would agree with everything he said, but one could infer from his many years of service here that most probably agreed with him because they had also enslaved people before the Civil War, and they knew that feeling of slavery, and they put forward the feeling of, oh, it was so easy. It was so good for them. We were so nice. We never treated them poorly. But we all know that's not the truth for most cases. When he died in 1912, he was the last remaining chaplain in the Confederacy. He was buried with full military honors from the Confederate Army. His casket was covered with the cadet gray of the Civil War, and his casket was covered with the flags of the Confederacy, Virginia, and North Carolina. And I'd be willing to bet he was buried in his uniform. Having just been incorporated as a town in 1871, as I said, Bethesda's just a tiny dot on the map. It had little more than a post office that was located across the street from the blacksmith shop, which was located on the corner of the only paved road in Montgomery County, known as Washington and Rockville Turnpike, commonly known at that time as the gateway to the nation's capital. And it's now, of course, Wisconsin Avenue and Old Georgetown Road, where the Bank of Bethesda building is today. According to the 1870 census, there were less than 300 families living in Bethesda, and many of them were Episcopalians. The very first service of the new mission was held in the fall of 1873 at the home of J. Heath Dodge, with the Reverend Everett presiding. After that, cottage services were held on weekdays with Reverend Everett in attendance because he couldn't do it on Sundays since he was the rector at Grace Church and had to be there. After a while, services were held in the parlor of Mr. Hilary Offutt's home until the chapel could be built. The founders of the church began construction of a chapel in April 1874 on land owned by Colonel Robert P. and Carolyn Dodge at the intersection of Bradley Lane and the Washington and Rockville Turnpike. So anxious were they to have a church in this neighborhood that they constructed the church before they had the land formally. It was a very informal thing that the Dodgers would give the land, but they finally did that on March 17th of 1875, a year after the church was built and being occupied. The structure was a wooden frame church with beautiful stained glass windows dedicated to a number of the parishioners at St. John's. It faced Bradley Lane. But since there was no heat that first year, they held their services during the winter at Hilary Offutt's parlor. Colonel Dodge and Hilary Offutt asked that the chapel be named St. John's after St. John's, Georgetown, since they had been vestry members there. And Reverend Everett asked that it be named Norwood, as that was the name of the Dodge family property. The Bethesda area was growing rapidly in the late 1800s and early 1900s. St. John's grew with the area, so much so that we started 3 mission churches. The first one in Garrett Park in 1896. And the second, we called it St. James, but it became Christ Church, Kensington. And the second church in 1897 at the Chevy Chase Circle, which there's a very interesting history to that, but I don't have time to go into it today. So if you want to ask a question afterwards, feel free. And the third church we started was a mission in Glen Echo in 1903, which is now the Church of the Redeemer. Oh, let's see, it should be the next one. Okay. There's a picture we have of that last, not that one, two before that. Yes. The man on the right there is William Offutt. The man next to him is Reverend Everett. And the gentleman next to him is Thomas Duncan. And the fourth man, I don't know who he is. Between 1887 and 1903, St. John's had 4 different rectors. As with Reverend Everett, they were each the rector of Grace Church. And they did their services during the day as during the weekday, as Reverend Everett had done. Their salary was 40 pounds of tobacco, and they traveled by horseback everywhere within the 40 square mile radius that encompassed the Lambeth Parish. In the 1900s, the first women's group was organized and called the Women's Guild. Its functions were those of the current day Altar Guild, which is basically a group of women. But now we have men and teenagers who assist, and they prepare the sanctuary for worship services and care for all our sacred items, including altar linens, chalices, candles, and anything that is consumed, such as communion, wine, and bread. In 1902, a parish hall with a kitchen and a basement was added to the frame church at a cost of $1,300. In 1903, the Reverend Cornell, who served from 1903 to 1904, was rector, and he started our first newsletter called St. John's Record. In 1904, the Reverend Thomas Duncan was called, and he served from 1904 to 1910. And during this time period, after much discussion at vestry meetings, oil lamps were replaced by electricity, both in the church and the parish hall. And in 1910, the land was given to the church for a building of a rectory on Old Georgetown Road. And then the next picture, this is a picture from probably taken around 1910. That small circle that you might be able to see on the upper right-hand side, that's St. John's. We are the only thing on Bradley Lane, the only thing. Most of the area was around it were farms, such as the farmland that the Dodges gave to us for our church. So sadly, the frame church was destroyed by fire on May 29th, 1914. And there are differing accounts of what happened that day. One of them was from a longtime parishioner's father, Bob Hampton's father, Horace Hampton, was an 8-year-old eyewitness, 8 years old. He is quoted in William Offutt's book as having said, "I had been down in Washington and I came out and got as far as the district line, and I looked up towards Bethesda and saw the sky all red. I was just a kid. The fire engine they had then was a 500-gallon tank on a chassis of a farm wagon pulled by a rope. It had been kept up in the barn behind the store where Community Hardware now sits. When I got up to Bradley Lane, everybody was sitting down watching the fire burn down because they'd used up all the water and there wasn't anything else to do." According to the Washington Post, the flames leveled the old church to the ground. The fire was a brilliant and spectacular one, attracting large crowds of people. They also noted that President Woodrow Wilson was speaking to the Princeton alumni at the Chevy Chase Club, and that his secret agents and many of the guests were among the first to arrive at the blaze. Almost immediately, a stone church was built on the same spot. That one. And you can see on the side, there's a building next to it. That's the rectory that they built and sold the rectory on Old Georgetown Road to get help pay for the fire, pay for the new church, I'm sorry. So it was built facing Bradley Lane, as had the original church. Our second published newsletter, St. John's Call, began during the time of Rector James Kirkpatrick, who served from 1913 to 1926. It was published weekly, and the first issue we know of was March 2nd, 1919. The last issue we have in the archives is dated May 1st, 1921. The newsletters are interesting, sometimes, a lot of times, very disturbing, and full of paid advertising. A little bit about James Kirkpatrick. His newsletters, which I just mentioned, are the only records we have of his time here at St. John's. It is a difficult legacy to talk about. He was raised in Northern Ireland as a Protestant and would have been brought up to despise Catholics, especially the Pope. He immigrated to America in 1886 and attended Princeton University, then the Philadelphia Divinity School. By June of 1920, Reverend Kirkpatrick's newsletters expressed his opinions on many subjects, including race, immigration, and religion. His opinions are not shared by anyone at St. John's now, I'm sure, but were probably indicative thoughts of many in 1920. He belittled other races in an article he wrote titled The Destiny of Races. In the July 4th issue, he wrote, "The strategic plan of the Church of Rome is clear. When Rome controls the United States, with Ireland in possession of England's enemies, the point of attack is simple, and England would make feeble resistance against America with her great population and boundless resources. The fall of England then would be the end of Protestantism and the end of civil and religious liberty in the world." Imagine being at home and getting this from your rector. Apparently, his views didn't offend the bulk of the church leaders in Bethesda and Montgomery County, because he was elected on July 5th, 1920, as president of the Montgomery County Christian League. What does that say about the area? Throughout history, women's voices have received very little attention. Fortunately, it's getting better. Women in the Episcopal Church were not allowed to vote, let alone run for office, until 1918, when an act of the Maryland legislature gave women in Chevy Chase and Christ Church, Kensington, the right to vote in church elections. According to Whiteman's book, for some reason, St. John's did not get that right until April 9th, 1928, when Dr. John Latane Lewis went to battle for the women's inherent right to vote. By granting women the right to vote, it also meant we could run for office and get elected to the vestry or elected as a warden. It took 57 years from 1928 before the first female warden was elected in 1985, and that was Judy Cousins. There have been 9 female rectors since then. St. John's was deeply in debt during the Roaring '20s. Even before the Great Depression hit, Reverend Clarence Parker's salary was cut from $3,000 to $2,000. And subsequently, he resigned, citing the poor salary. The services of a janitor were suspended for 5 months, with the church property being cared for by members of the vestry. The organist volunteered to take a deep reduction in his salary. However, by the annual meeting on April 21st, 1930, the church reported that it was again solvent and hired a new rector, Joseph Williams. Starting in 1936, a unique effort was introduced to start a building fund towards increasing the accommodations of the parish hall and church school using pence cans. The pence cans were the idea of a group called the Layman's League at St. John's. It was unique to St. John's. The idea, the individual families were asked to put pennies, nickels, and dimes in a tin can at their homes after the blessing at mealtime. In a letter signed by Robert Hill as chief penceman, dated January 23rd, 1943, Hill stated that monies from the pence cans had been collected monthly by individual volunteers, but that collection had to cease because of rationing due to the war efforts in World War I. Have you seen the movie Oppenheimer? Did you notice there are future parishioners in the movie? They were involved in the Manhattan Project and the buildings of the Weapons Research Laboratory at Los Alamos, where the bomb was created. One was Lyle Johnson, and he joined St. John's in July of 1958. And Robert Furman, also known as Bob Furman, who joined in March of 1952. Johnson was an FBI agent and Furman, and he was responsible for security at Los Alamos. And Bob Furman was responsible for building the entire Los Alamos community. According to Carol Johnson Phillips, Lyle's daughter, the actor who portrayed her father resembled him quite well. Our rector during World War II, Reverend Williams, was in poor health and he wanted to retire, but he stayed on until the end of the war at the request of the vestry, who hoped we'd be able to find a new rector from the many chaplains returning from service overseas. Reverend Williams served until December 13th, 1945. In 1946, the Reverend William Crichton was hired as rector. Reverend Crichton has served as a Navy chaplain in Normandy during World War II. He served as our rector from 1946 to 1959. As everyone knows, under the presidency of FDR, Bethesda and the region grew with the federal government. As a result, our church building soon became too small. A building committee was formed to plan for a larger church, and with the stone church being attached for Sunday school classrooms and offices. Excuse me. In 1947, ground was broken for our current church. In 1949, there were approximately 1,000 families living in Bethesda affiliated with St. John's, and of that number, 700 were active. By 1951, we were renting houses in the area for Sunday school classes because there wasn't enough room. And we were having meetings in the kitchen, in the old stone building, and in private homes. The Women of St. John's, or WSJ as they were known, was organized in January of 1950. It melded all the other various women groups into one banner. In December 1950, they went to Reverend Crichton and asked about their desire to, quote, do something other than bake sales, and stated they wanted to start a thrift shop, unquote. Subsequently, a special meeting of the vestry was held on January 4th, 1951, and the women were granted authorization to set up a shop for the sale of used goods to be sold to the public. In a letter to the vestry dated February 2nd, just 4 weeks and 1 day after the vestry agreed to the idea of a shop, the women had worked out all the details and were ready to start business. The original Opportunity Shop is located in a tiny cottage at 7230 Wisconsin Avenue. It has relocated twice since then and has been instrumental in the community and is a part of St. John's since its very beginning. With their profits, they have made donations to St. John's, including buying the rectory that was in Bethesda, Chevy Chase Village, with their profits. And they continue to give donations to St. John's and many local charities in Bethesda. In 1954, we continued to grow, and St. Luke's Mission was established by St. John's on Old Georgetown Road. 2 years later, we had a mission in Potomac that is now St. Francis. In 1956, fundraising began for the office and church school wing. In 1957, the old stone church was used as a library and informal meeting space. And Reverend Crichton resigned to become Bishop Coadjutor of the Diocese of Washington. Associate Bill Beal, became rector. He was also a veteran of World War II, having served as an officer in the Navy. The 1960s were a turbulent time for the nation and for us at St. John's. One of the first things we did was start a construction committee in 1962 to build a chapel and the startup money for that came from the legacy of Ida P. Young. The Chapel of St. Mary was dedicated on November 26th in her memory. In 1963, another of our mission churches was started in the Montrose Road area, and that's now St. James, Rockville. By 1964, there were 775 students enrolled in 36 Sunday school classes from nursery to high school. 775 students. Nancy, can you imagine? The youth group traveled on a mission to Nicaragua. And if you look at this picture there, on the top part, the second person from the left is our own Barbara Wardway, who's still with us these days, which is great. Barbara, yeah. The fall fairs began in 1972. I'm sorry, in 1969. And it later became known as the Williamsburg Fair, and it was quite a community happening. People would stand in line for hours before the doors opened, hoping to get a bargain or to find booksellers, especially, were looking for that rare first edition book. And they found them a number of times. The fairs continued until 1989. The 1970s were another busy time at St. John's. After months of discussion on the need for a free clinic for the youth in Montgomery County, which would provide free psychiatric counseling and medical treatment, on December 8, 1970, the church voted to establish the Montgomery Free Medical Clinic in the basement of St. John's. It was later renamed the Bach Memorial Free Clinic. During their first year, the clinic aided more than 2,800 patients, an average of 30 to 35 each night. They were open, but they weren't open every day. You all remember Watergate. Well, in 1962, one of our parishioners, Kenneth Parkinson, was a member. He was hired to become a member of President Nixon's re-election committee, or CREEP, as we knew it in the day. He was indicted by a federal grand jury with regard to the Watergate scandal, but he was acquitted in 1975. Women were not allowed to be ordained as clergy up to this point in the Episcopal Church. On July 29, 1974, 11 women were ordained in the Episcopal Church in Philadelphia in total defiance of church policy.
Thank goodness.
No. Notice the men were the ones who got excited with that. Our vestry, led by senior warden Paul Carew, in a split vote, voted to invite one of those women to come to St. John's to preach and to celebrate Holy Communion. In our newsletter, Revelations, Reverend Beale said no, because Bishop Crichton asked him to delay until the meeting of the General Convention of the Episcopal Church. It caused quite a bit of bad feelings at the time, although it's now clear that both men strongly supported ordination of women. Bishop Crichton's own plan was that since he felt diocesan bishops already had the power to ordain women, he would ordain women in the fall of 1976, regardless of the vote of the General Convention. In the article, Reverend Beale is quoted as saying, "The present discrimination against women in the priesthood of the Episcopal Church is immoral and unjust. My wish is that he, Bishop Crichton, wouldn't wait so long." Thankfully, on September 15th, 1976, at the General Convention, women were approved for ordination in the Episcopal Church. Sadly, Reverend Beale died suddenly of a heart attack after services on Sunday, February 25th, 1979. He had served for almost 20 years and is the longest serving rector to date. After an exhaustive search process, the Reverend Dwayne Alvord was called as our rector, and he began in September 1980. The Reverend Marion Wendell, a former parishioner who is now ordained, was the first of many female priests here at St. John's. The 1980s were also a busy time here, as there were many changes under Dwayne's leadership. In 1981, parishioner Sally Ketchum founded the Core Service Hospice at Home in her home. That service was and is today Montgomery Hospice. And for 10 years, they had their offices in the basement of the church. In 1987, ground was broken for the Bishop Crichton Memorial Garden and Fountain. Recognizing the need for the homeless population in Bethesda, a group of local clergy, including Reverend Alvord, started Bethesda Cares in 1988. We have been involved with Bethesda Cares ever since. Their work includes providing lunches, counseling, clothing, and housing to those who need them. From 1989 until 2010, their clothing closet was located in the basement of St. John's. We helped to furnish at least 3 apartments for first-time owners of housing in the program, including their Bethesda Cares effort in 2015 to provide housing for all veterans. In 1989, a Stephen Ministry program was started by Associate Rector Janice Robinson. Stephen ministers are members of St. John's who have taken extensive training so they can provide confidential, one-to-one Christian care to people in the parish who are experiencing a difficult time. They listen, care, encourage, pray, and provide weekly support for as long as needed. In 1990, work was begun on renovation of St. Mary's Chapel, and an organ was donated by Charles and Nancy Weeking for the chapel. In the mid-1990s, we started working with Shepherd's Table by providing a chilly meal there once a month up to the present time. The charity first started working out of a small house and feeding the homeless. They are now in a new building in Silver Spring where 90 to over 200 are fed each week. St. John's provides the teams that shop, cook, deliver, and serve 4 times a year. We are proud of our relationship with Shepherd's Table. In 1995, major renovation of the church with the installation of an elevator, glass doors in the front, and improvements to the West Avenue entrance, and other changes began after a long capital campaign. In 1996, Reverend Alvord retired, but work on the church continued. In September of 1997, the Reverend Susan Gressinger, later Flanders, became the first female rector at St. John's. Under her leadership, we had another capital campaign, which funded a new organ and renovated the altar area. She also started the Come As You Are service at 5 o'clock with a grant from the Norwood Parish Fund. Under Reverend Flanders' guidance, we continued our work with Interfaith Works, where we supply overnight housing for 1 week during the winter to their homeless clients. In 1997, the county provided a co-ed homeless shelter for them and asked the local churches to provide the meals on a rotating basis. We would drop off breakfast in the morning and provide a bagged lunch when it was our turn. In 2005, the county made it a women's shelter for 35 women. Teams of parishioners continue to provide and serve dinners for 1 week in August and January each year. We also help with clothing and supplies on an as-needed basis and continue to offer non-profit financial donations too. In 2008, Reverend Flanders retired after serving for 11 years. After a search process, the Reverend Sari Atik was installed as our rector. He was born in Bethlehem and Jerusalem, sorry. Are you sure? Are you sure, sir? And he was raised in the Holy Land. So he became our rector on November 14th, 2010. In the 13 years that Sari has been with us, we have continued to grow and strengthen our ties with our community and beyond. In keeping with this background, Sari has led a number of pilgrimages for St. John's parishioners and others to the Holy Land. Also under Sari's guidance, we have continued and expanded our work with local charities, including Lutheran Social Services. Excuse me again. In 2016, we furnished several apartments for new residents in their program. And in 2017, we began the work of bringing a refugee family to America. We were given a family of 10 from the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And we had a large team of about 150 volunteers who worked tirelessly to help get them assimilated to America. The family is now totally independent and living in, I believe, Michigan. Wisconsin, thank you. Under Sari's guidance, we have marched in the gay parade each year and have a committee to end gun violence. In March 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic arrived and the church and everything else was shut down. The church was shut down at the instruction of the Bishop of Washington. During the pandemic, services and meetings were held on Zoom. Masks were made and donated. We started Nourishing Bethesda, headed by John Ross. Nourishing Bethesda initially provided meals for a family of 4 each week. It is now an independent 501(c)(3) organization with its own board, and many of St. John's members serve on that board. In conclusion, there are parts of our history that are very disturbing and hard to accept. Yet we have grown and changed in our faith and actions over the years. We have developed a special focus at St. John's of trying to follow Christ's example by helping the neediest people in our community. There are so many examples of that. The Op Shop, Hospice, the Bach Memorial Free Clinic, Bethesda Cares, Shepherd's Table, Nourishing Bethesda. There is so much more activity going on at St. John's that I could talk about, but I'm going on too long as it is. So I'll end it here. As the Bishop of Maryland said of St. John's in 1880, this parish is full of life and energy. The work is a marvel. So that's our history. And if there's anything else you'd like to know, please feel to ask. But before I take questions, I'd like to thank Terry DeLeon, please stand, and Clara Lovett. Terry comes most Tuesdays to help me in the archives, and Clara comes most Fridays to help me in the archives. I also want to thank Barbara Ordway. Barbara has given me numerous tidbits of information over the years since she pretty much grew up here. And I'd also like to thank Carol Johnson Phillips she is on Zoom, and she has been very helpful in all of this. So thank you, and I'll take questions.
Anybody have any questions? Yes, go ahead. Give it to the microphone, please.
Thanks, Cathy. That was fabulous, as always. I just wondered if you found any history in the archives that we had deacons before I came. Were there any other deacons, and were
Not
they?
that I know of.
No. Okay, interesting. I
I
thought
may
that
be
there were.
wrong, but not that I know of.
Oh, thank you.
Okay. Say what?
Barbara says she remembers a deacon. Pardon me?
Oh, Deacon
interns.
Okay,
Okay, I'd be interested.
okay. I'll look into that more closely. Clara, can you come up to the mic, please?
We need to use the microphone so that people online can hear this. Otherwise, you're wondering you will not.
A very small footnote. In the years when the parish was growing rapidly, we didn't have deacons, but we did have seminarians. In those days, when a seminary student was close enough to having completed his or her keys at first, they helped the clergy.
Thank you. That's a good point.
You mentioned that Judy Cousins was our first senior warden,
Mhm.
57 years after women were finally allowed to vote. Were there women members of the vestry between the time the vote was authorized and Judy was elected as warden?
Well, between 1928, when we got the right to vote, and 1945, it's hard to know because the records were kept with initials. So I don't know for certain, but I think the first woman was in 1945 because she's listed in the vestry charts as Mrs. Earl O'Donnell. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm curious, I don't know if this puts you on the spot or not in terms of like your knowledge of this, but obviously the 50s were a very different like time socially. And I'm assuming that the way the church functioned was different than it is today. So my curiosity is with a Sunday school that big, for example, had the church hired somebody to run church school? Is that, and how big was the staff team to handle that kind of stuff? Like was it mainly volunteer based or was the staff bigger? How did that work back then?
It was mainly volunteer, but parishioner Pat Hawfield was hired to be the superintendent of church school. And she did a bang up job. And then there's been a succession of DREs, Director of Religious Education, since then, some clergy, some not. I was a DRE for a time, and I can tell you it's a hard job. So, Barbara.
When the church was at its biggest, Easter service was held in the parish hall as well, and the sound was piped in, but there were no pictures. There was a rector, an associate rector, and an assistant rector, plus the staff. So there was more staffing then. And the high school students helped take care of the youngest children in the Sunday school. There was a teacher, but there were a number of high school students who also helped out in the classrooms of the younger children.
Thank you.
And there were there was still a class that is an educational class for the high schoolers and junior high school students.
Thank you. Thank you. Any other questions? Jay?
Do we have time for you to tell the story of All Saints? Because I don't know it.
The story of All Saints.
Yeah.
Yes, in the late 1800s, Senator Francis Newlands bought up a lot of the territory that is now Chevy Chase. And he wanted to develop a community for white people to have safe space to be. And one of the things he promised them, people who bought, was that there would be an Episcopal church within the boundaries of Chevy Chase Village. And he was going to build the church. Well, the vestry heard that and wrote to him and said, "You can't build the church. Only the Episcopal church can build the church." So he gave us the land that All Saints is located on. And there's quite a difference in the two churches. As I understand it, All Saints has always been high church, and we're considered middle church according to their standards. And it took some parishioners away, but not many. And as the years went on, we got bigger and bigger. So thank you. Peter?
Cathy, are there any records of activism in the church during the 60s with respect to either the anti-war movement or the civil rights movement during that decade?
Thank you. There's not much about either subject, but as far as civil rights went, the clergy, starting with the presiding bishop on down, asked churches to recognize that this was a project that we should be involved with, because Christ recognizes everyone, regardless of their skin color or their religion, to be good people. And so there's some record of parishioners helping out by providing homes for people to stay in during the March on Washington. And there's some talk about people going down and participating in the march itself, but not much. Not much, thank you. Anyone? Clara? Oh.
At the height of the civil rights struggle, particularly late 60s, early 70s, and the events in Washington, D.C., the St. John's congregation was split. That's pretty obvious from vestry minutes. Probably a majority of parishioners were supportive of the civil rights movement, but there was always a contingent that was not. And so the rectors over time were in a difficult position, because sometimes they got one message from the diocese, from the bishop, and a different message from the grassroots. That's sort of inevitable, but over time, St. John's clearly shifted to a very active position in favor of civil rights.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, we sent our youth group down in response to a plea from the Bishop of Washington into the inner city to help students during the summer and we provided tutoring and arts and crafts projects and outdoor playground time for the kids down there. And we have some pictures of that, which I didn't think to put in this this talk, but they went down there for what looks like a 2-week period and worked with the people there. Pam.
Hi, Cathy. I'm enjoying your talk so much, but
Thank you.
there are a couple of things I hope that you'll insert in your text. One is that is about the free clinic that Dr. Lou Scott started here. It was started because of the problems for teenagers that they couldn't go to their family physicians about: contraception, STDs, and drug use.
Right.
And so that was phenomenal to me that he was that compassionate and that active in starting that clinic. The other thing is, I'd like you to add that the J2A curriculum was added under Susan Flanders and Nancy Durr, and the youth pilgrimages.
Right.
And also, what about the Norwood School that occupied our education wing and then went to a suburban, farther out campus? Was that affiliated with St. John's?
The Norwood School was started here at St. John's. A parishioner went to Crichton and said, or I think it was Crichton or Beale, and said, why isn't there an Episcopal church here? Episcopal school here. You've got the building for it. Why don't we have a school? So a school was started. It was called the Norwood School. Reverend Beale was on the board of directors of the school, as were a number of the vestry members. And the Reverend Beale would go once a week to have chapel services with the kids. So it was pure Episcopalian. And a number of parishioners here sent their kids there. Barbara went there for a time. Rob went there. You went there?
No.
No, okay.
I just wanted to add an unofficial rumor that was told to me when I worked in the church office, that there was a falling out between Dwayne and the headmistress of the Norwood School over the heating bill. And that Norwood School got into such a snit that they just moved without informing Dwayne, and they just came in and the whole education wing was empty and they were gone.
That's true. Over the years, there have been 3 schools that are here at St. John's. The Norwood School, followed by the Concord Hill School, which is now down on Wisconsin Avenue in a church buildings, which is ironic. And the third one is the Oneness Family School that's here with us today. And their philosophy is the one that is most aligned with ours, of people being equal, and everyone should have a chance and opportunity to thrive in this area.
Thanks very much.
Yeah.
I know you got to get to the services, but while I've got a captive audience here, please come next Sunday for the forum that Jay Mallon here will be hosting. And in fact, the rest of October, all of the forums are really looking very exciting. Jay's is going to be on a historical look at St. John's neighborhood, and then our very own Reverend John Talbert is going to be hosting the one on the 15th about who is your neighbor and what does that entail? A theological discussion. It's sort of demographical information about our neighborhood that I think will be fascinating. You should also know that the very first of the town hall series begins on October 22nd, and that will be on the roots of food insecurity. So a panel of which Nourishing Bethesda will be a part, but have many county executives and other people involved in food insecurity on that panel that day. We have a special movie night on October 27th that is being hosted by the Children and Family Group on showing the movie Coco as a preview to our discussion of Day of the Dead, All Saints, All Souls, and Halloween, which comes that Sunday after that on the 29th. So it's going to be a very exciting month, lots of stuff going on. And there's a big article in Crossroads about it, so please review that. And thank you so much for coming today.